The town of Millhaven woke up slowly. Smoke rose from chimneys. Roosters called out from backyard pens. The smell of bread drifted from the baker's window on the main road. But in the yard behind Walt's repair shop, something else was happening. A shadow moved along the fence line. It was low to the ground, careful and quiet. Anyone walking past on the road would not have noticed it. The shadow paused at the gate, sniffed the air twice, then slipped through the gap where the bottom hinge had rusted loose years ago. Walt had never fixed that gap. He always meant to. He never did. The shadow stepped into the yard and became a drake. He was young. That much was clear. His body still had the lean, unfinished look of a drake that had not yet filled out. His green scales were dull and patchy, the color of old leaves left out in the rain too long. His ribs showed faintly under the skin. His claws were chipped. His left wing was folded tight against his side, and every now and then, when he moved too quickly, something in that wing made him flinch and stop. He stood still for a moment in the center of the yard and looked around. There were old cart wheels stacked against the shed wall. There were iron bars and bent axles piled near the fence. There were broken tools hanging on nails, coils of rope, a cracked water trough, and in the far corner, a long mound of scrap that Walt had been adding to for the better part of 20 years. Bones of machines. Pieces of things that no longer had names. The drake moved toward the scrap pile. He did not rush. He moved the way a hungry animal moves when it has learned that rushing leads to noise and noise leads to trouble. He put each foot down with care. His long neck swept low as he walked, his nose working the air in slow pulls. He reached the edge of the pile and began to dig through it with his snout. He was not looking for metal. He was looking for anything that might have been food once. A bone. A scrap of dried meat stuck to an old tin. A piece of leather that had not yet gone completely rotten. He had eaten worse things. He had eaten much worse things. Walt saw him from the doorway. Walt was not an early riser by nature. He was a man who believed that the morning had no reason to start before the coffee was ready. He was standing in the doorway of his shop with a chipped mug in both hands, still wearing his work apron from the night before because he had fallen asleep in his chair again. His gray hair stuck up on one side. His boots were unlaced. He watched the drake dig through his scrap pile. He did not shout. He did not reach for the old broom he kept by the door for chasing off strays. He just stood there and drank his coffee and watched. The drake had not noticed him yet. The wind was blowing the wrong way. The drake kept digging, patient and quiet, pulling things aside with his snout and then letting them drop when they were not what he needed. Walt watched the way the drake held his left wing. He watched the careful flinch every time the wing shifted. He had fixed enough broken things in his life to recognize something that was healing wrong. He went back inside. He came out 2 minutes later carrying a wide tin bowl. The bowl had been sitting on the back of the stove since last night. It was full of the stew he had made and not finished. Thick broth, soft vegetables, and the leftover bones of a smoked river bird that had given up all their flavor to the pot. It was not fancy. It was warm. Walt walked across the yard without hurrying. He did not try to be quiet, but he did not make extra noise either. He moved the way he moved when he was working around a nervous animal. Steady. Even. No sudden changes. The drake heard him when he was about halfway across the yard. The young creature spun around fast, wings half lifting before the left one pulled him up short with a jolt of pain. He hissed. It was not a fierce hiss. It was the hiss of something that hurt and was frightened and did not want to show either of those things. He planted his feet and stared at Walt with yellow eyes that were too old for his young face. Walt stopped walking. He looked at the drake for a moment. Then he crouched down, set the bowl on the ground, and slid it forward across the dirt until it was about 3 feet from the drake's front feet. Then he stood back up, turned around and walked back to the shop doorway. He picked up his coffee mug from the step where he had left it. He leaned against the door frame. He looked out at the sky over the rooftops and thought about what needed to be done today. The Pemberton cart axle was still waiting. The water pump from the Greer farm needed a new seal. It was going to be a full day. Behind him, he heard nothing for a long moment. Then he heard the soft sound of a tongue working against a tin bowl. He did not turn around. He drank his coffee. The sun came up over the eastern rooftops and turned the yard gold for a little while, the way it did on clear mornings in early autumn. Somewhere down the street, the baker's boy was calling out the morning loaves. Walt finished his coffee and went inside to start the fire in the forge. When he came back out 20 minutes later, the bowl was empty. It had been licked so clean it looked almost washed. The drake was gone. But the gap in the fence, Walt noticed, had been pushed a little wider on the way out. The second morning was colder than the first. A thin frost had settled on the rooftops overnight and the yard was gray and still when Walt came out with his coffee. He looked at the gap in the fence without thinking much about it. Then he went to the forge and got the fire going. He had work to do. The Pemberton mill cart was sitting in the middle of the yard where two men had rolled it in the evening before. The left rear axle had snapped clean through. It was not a complicated job, but it was a heavy one, and Walt's back had been telling him for 3 years now that he was not as young as he used to think he was. He set his coffee down on the workbench and pulled on his gloves. He heard the fence gap creak at 7:15. He did not look up. He kept his eyes on the axle housing and kept turning the bolt he was working loose. It was rusted in deep and needed slow, steady pressure. Walt was good at slow and steady. It was about the only thing he had ever been naturally good at. The footsteps came across the yard carefully. 4 feet. Light on the frost. Stopping once near the scrap pile, then moving again. Coming closer. Walt reached to his left without looking and picked up the second wrench from the ground. He held it out to the side, away from his body, at about the height a drake's nose would be if a drake were standing 2 feet away. There was a pause. Then something took the wrench from his hand. Walt kept working. For a while there was just the sound of the two of them breathing and the metal sounds of the repair work. Walt loosened the broken axle housing bolt by bolt and laid the pieces out in a line on the ground the way he always did, so he could remember the order when it came time to put things back together. He pointed at each piece as he set it down. Not to explain. Just from habit. The way he had always worked, talking to himself without words. Ash watched each piece go down. His yellow eyes moved along the line. After the 4th piece, when Walt pointed at the 5th bolt and then looked at the housing, Ash put his nose against the housing and pushed it slightly to the left, showing Walt the second crack running along the underside that Walt had not yet seen. Walt looked at it. He nodded once. He went to the shed and came back with a different tool. A longer one for the angle. He handed it to Ash without ceremony and pointed at the crack. Ash held the tool against the housing at the angle Walt had shown him. Walt worked the repair from the other side. Neither of them said anything. By mid-morning the frost had melted and the sun was warm on the yard stones. Walt's back was complaining steadily but he ignored it the way he had learned to ignore it. Ash had stopped flinching every time he shifted his left wing. The yard was quiet except for the sound of work. A woman came to the yard gate just before noon. She was one of the weavers from the upper street, dropping off a broken spinning wheel for Walt to look at later. She stopped at the gate when she saw Ash. Her hand went to her collar. She stared. Ash looked at her. He did not move. He did not make a sound. He just looked at her with his old yellow eyes and then looked back at the cart axle he was holding steady with his tail while Walt bolted the new housing into place. The woman left the spinning wheel just inside the gate and walked away quickly without saying what she had come to say. Walt did not comment on it. By noon the cart was done. Walt rolled it back and forth across the yard twice to test it. The axle held clean and smooth. He nodded at it the way he nodded at things that had come out right. He went inside and came back with 2 bowls. One for himself. One wider and deeper, set on the ground near the corner of the shed where the wall caught the afternoon sun and held the warmth longer than anywhere else in the yard. The food was simple. Thick soup with bread on the side for Walt. The same soup, more of it, with the leftover bones from last night's pot, for Ash. Ash ate. Then he sat in the corner where the sun was warm and folded his wings in and closed his eyes halfway. Walt sat on his work stool and ate his soup and looked at the finished cart. He thought about the second crack Ash had spotted. He would not have found that crack until the housing failed again, probably in the middle of a loaded run. It would have cost the Pemberton family a broken wheel, a spilled load, maybe worse on a bad road. He looked over at the drake in the corner. Ash had his eyes fully closed now. His breathing had gone slow and even. The dull green scales on his side caught a little of the sun and looked, for a moment, almost bright. His left wing was still folded wrong. It would keep healing wrong unless something was done about it. Walt had seen enough broken things to know that a break left alone did not simply get better. It got used to being broken. He finished his soup and set the bowl down. He did not say anything. There was no one to say anything to. But he looked at the corner of the yard where the sun was warm and the wall cut the wind, and he thought that it was a decent enough spot. Dry. Sheltered. Better than whatever the drake had been sleeping in before. He went back to work. Ash stayed until dark. It happened on a Thursday. Walt had asked Ash to help clear the back corner of the shed. It was the corner that Walt never went into if he could help it. It was stacked with things that had been put there to be dealt with later, and later had never come. Old crates. Rolled canvas. A broken ladder. 3 years of things that Walt had carried in and set down and walked away from. Ash was good at moving things. He was careful with his tail and careful with his claws, and he had learned quickly which things were fragile and which things were not. Walt directed him with short words and small gestures, and Ash followed them the way he had learned to follow the rhythms of the yard. Quietly. Without fuss. They worked through the corner steadily. Walt sorted and Ash moved. The broken ladder went out. The canvas went out. The crates were stacked neater along the far wall. The shed began to breathe again the way a room breathes when it has been cleared of old weight. Then Ash backed up to move a long iron shelf, and his tail swept wide. It caught the edge of something on a low shelf that Walt had not seen because it was behind the canvas. The thing fell. It hit the stone floor hard, and the old lock on it snapped, and the lid came open, and everything inside scattered across the floor in a fan of paper and color and small objects that skidded across the stones and came to rest in the dust. Walt turned at the sound. He went very still. Ash turned too. He looked at the mess on the floor and then looked at Walt, and something in the old man's face made the drake go still as well. Ash lowered himself slowly until his belly was against the floor. He did not know what he had done, but he knew he had done something. He waited. Walt did not shout. He did not say anything at all. He walked over to the scattered things and crouched down and began to pick them up one by one. His hands moved slowly. He was not careful the way a man is careful with delicate things. He was careful the way a man is careful with things that hurt to touch. There were letters. A small stack of them tied with a piece of blue ribbon that had come undone in the fall. The handwriting on them was round and uneven, the way a child's handwriting looks when the child is still learning that letters have a correct shape. Walt gathered them and held them in both hands without reading them. There were drawings. Done in pencil and colored chalk on rough paper. Most of them were drawings of drakes. Some flying. Some curled up sleeping. Some with names written underneath in the same round uneven hand. The names were things like Ember and Stone and Greenfoot. One drawing showed a drake sitting next to a small girl with brown hair. The girl had drawn herself smiling so wide the smile went off the edge of her face. Walt picked up each drawing carefully and set it on his knee. And then there was the small carved wooden drake. It was sitting upright where it had landed against the base of the shelf. It was carved from pale wood and painted green. Not expertly painted. The green was uneven and went outside the lines in places, and one of the wings was slightly larger than the other. But it had been painted with great care. Every scale had been given its own small stroke of color. The eyes were painted yellow, and someone had put a tiny dot of white in each one to make them look alive. Walt picked it up last. He sat down on the floor of the shed the way a man sits down when his legs have decided for him. He sat with the letters in one hand and the little wooden drake in the other, and the drawings spread on the stones around him, and he did not say anything for a long time. Ash watched him from across the shed. The drake's yellow eyes moved over Walt's face. Over the letters. Over the drawings. Over the small carved thing in Walt's hand. Ash was not a young creature who understood many things about humans. But he understood grief. He had seen it in the hills, in the animals that stayed near the place where another animal had fallen. He had felt something like it himself, in a cold den a long time ago, before he had learned not to think about that. He got up from the floor slowly. He crossed the shed without making a sound. He stood beside Walt for a moment. Then he lowered his head and rested it gently against the old man's shoulder. Not pressing. Not demanding anything. Just resting there. The way something rests when it wants another thing to know it is not alone. Walt's hand came up after a moment and rested on the side of Ash's neck. His thumb moved once across the dull green scales. Then he was still. He told Ash about Rose without really meaning to. The words came out quiet and slow, the way water comes out of a crack in old stone. She had been 7 when she got sick. She had drawn drakes every day for the last year of her life. She had named every drake she ever drew. She had asked Walt once if drakes were real, and Walt had told her yes, and she had asked if she could meet one someday, and Walt had said someday. Someday had not come in time. The little wooden drake had been her favorite thing. Walt had carved it for her birthday. She had painted it herself. When Walt finished talking, the shed was very quiet. Ash did not move his head from the old man's shoulder. Walt looked down at the wooden drake in his hand. Then he looked at the real one beside him. Something shifted in his chest. Something that had been sitting in the wrong place for 3 winters moved very slightly toward where it belonged. He had thought Ash kept coming back for food. He understood now that that was not the whole truth. And he understood something else too. Something he had no words for. Only the feeling of it, warm and quiet, sitting in the shed with the letters and the drawings and the small painted drake, while outside the autumn wind moved through the yard and the forge ticked as it cooled. Neither of them moved for a long time. Word travels fast in a small town. By the end of the first week, everyone in Millhaven knew that Walt the mechanic had a drake living in his yard. Some people heard it from the weaver woman who had come to drop off her spinning wheel. Some heard it from the baker's boy who passed the yard every morning on his delivery round. Some heard it from their children who had started taking the long way to school just to walk past Walt's fence and peek through the gap. Most people did not know what to think about it. A few decided quickly that they did not like it. Grant was one of those people. Grant ran the largest trading post in Millhaven. He sold tools and cloth and seed and lamp oil and about 40 other things that people needed and could not easily get anywhere else. His shop was 3 buildings down from Walt's repair yard on the same road. He was a wide man with a red face and the kind of voice that filled a room without trying. He had strong opinions about most things and he shared them freely and often. On the 8th day he came to Walt's yard in the morning. Walt was under a wagon when Grant arrived. Only Walt's boots were visible from the gate. Grant pushed the gate open and walked in and stopped when he saw Ash sitting near the forge. Ash looked at him. Grant looked at Ash. Grant took a step back without meaning to and then stopped himself and stood very straight. Walt slid out from under the wagon and looked up at Grant from the ground. Grant said that the Drake needed to go. He said it the way he said most things, like it was already decided and he was simply informing Walt of the fact. He said that customers were nervous. He said that 3 people had already crossed to the other side of the road rather than walk past the yard. He said that a Drake in the middle of town was not normal and not safe and not good for anyone's business, including Walt's own. Walt sat up and wiped his hands on his apron. He said no. Grant's red face got a little redder. He said Walt was being unreasonable. He said the town had a right to feel safe. He said if Walt would not do it willingly then the town council would have something to say about it at the next meeting. Walt said the next meeting was 2 weeks away and Grant was welcome to attend it. Grant left. He came back 2 days later. This time he did not come alone. He brought 2 men with him. One was called Hud, who worked the grain store and was large in the way that men who move heavy sacks all day become large. The other was a younger man named Pip who worked for Grant in the trading post and did most things Grant told him to do without asking why. Both of them carried long wooden poles, the kind used for moving livestock. Walt was at his workbench when they came through the gate. He straightened up and looked at the 3 of them. Then he looked at the poles. His face did not change very much, but something behind his eyes went flat and quiet. Ash was in his corner by the shed wall. He had been sleeping in the thin morning sun. He heard the gate and opened his eyes and looked at the 3 men standing in his yard. He stood up. Grant pointed at Ash and told Hud and Pip to get on with it. Neither man moved immediately. Up close, Ash was larger than he had seemed from the gate. His yellow eyes were steady and clear and looking directly at them. He was not growling. He was not spreading his wings. He was simply standing and looking at them the way something looks when it is not afraid but is paying very close attention. Hud gripped his pole tighter. Pip gripped his pole and took 1 step forward and then stopped. Walt walked around his workbench and stood beside Ash. He did not pick up a tool. He did not raise his voice. He just stood next to the Drake the way you stand next to something that belongs to you and that you are not going to move away from. Grant started talking again. His voice was louder now. It carried out into the road. People walking past slowed down. A few stopped at the gate to look. Children heading to the morning lessons at the schoolhouse pressed up against the fence boards and peered through the gaps. One of them slipped through the gap. She was small, maybe 6 years old, with dark braids and muddy boots and the kind of face that has not yet learned to be cautious about things. Her name was Nell. She had been walking past Walt's fence every morning for a week. She had been watching Ash through the gaps. She had decided several days ago that Ash was the most interesting thing she had ever seen and she had been waiting for a moment when the gate was open. The gate was open. She walked straight across the yard while the adults were all looking at each other. She walked up to Ash and looked at his left wing where the old scar ran in a pale line across 3 of the scale panels. She reached up with one small hand and touched it. Ash looked down at her. He made a low sound in his throat. Not a warning. Something softer than that. Nell patted the scarred wing twice and then looked up at him with complete seriousness and said he was very pretty. The yard went quiet. Hud lowered his pole. He did it slowly without looking at Grant, the way a man lowers something when he has realized he should not have picked it up in the first place. Pip lowered his a moment later. Grant stood with his mouth slightly open. At the fence, the children were pressing closer. 2 more had come through the gap. A mother passing on the road had stopped and was watching Nell stand next to the Drake, and the mother's face was not frightened. It was something else. Something softer. Grant looked around at all of it. At Hud and Pip with their poles lowered. At the children at the fence. At Walt standing quiet and unmoved beside the Drake. At the small girl with her hand on the scarred wing. He said nothing more. He turned around and walked out of the gate. Hud and Pip followed him. Pip looked back once before he turned the corner. What was on his face was hard to name. Something between embarrassment and something that might, given enough time, become a different opinion. Walt looked down at Nell. He asked her if her mother knew where she was. Nell said probably not. Walt walked her back to the gate and pointed her in the direction of the road and watched her go. Then he turned back to the yard. Ash was still standing where he had been. 3 more children were now through the fence gap and standing in a small cluster a few feet away from him, watching him with round eyes. Ash looked at them. His tail moved once, slowly, side to side. One of the children laughed. Walt picked up his wrench and went back to work. The first frost came on a quiet night. Walt saw it in the morning when he came out with his coffee. It was on the rooftops and on the fence posts and on the long grass at the edge of the yard. It made everything look clean and sharp and new. He stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed the cold air and looked at the yard the way a man looks at something he has gotten used to being glad about. Ash was already awake in his corner. He had his head up and his nose in the air, reading the cold the way drakes read things, with patience and with all of himself. When he heard Walt's boots on the step he turned and looked at him. His scales had changed over the weeks. They were not dull anymore. They caught the early light and held it the way healthy scales do, like there was something lit from underneath. Walt raised his coffee mug slightly in Ash's direction. Ash blinked once. Then he stood and stretched, long and slow, his good wings spreading wide and the left one opening a little further than it had a month ago. The old scar was still there. It would always be there. But the wing moved more freely now. Walt had worked on it carefully over several evenings, the way he worked on anything that had healed wrong, with patience and the right tools and no rushing. The town had changed around them while they were not paying attention to it changing. It had not happened all at once. It had happened the way most real things happen, slowly and without announcement. First it was just the children. They came every day after lessons, pressing through the fence gap or waiting politely at the gate if Walt had left it open, which he had started doing more often. Ash let them sit near him. He let them touch his scales and ask him questions he could not answer in words but answered in other ways, with the tilt of his head or the slow movement of his tail or the low sound he made in his throat that everyone had come to understand meant something like yes or something like I hear you. Then it was the parents coming to collect their children and staying a little longer than they needed to. Then it was neighbors stopping to talk to Walt over the fence while Ash moved around the yard behind him. Then it was people nodding at Ash on the road when Walt took him out to help haul timber from the yard at the edge of town, which had become a regular thing since the timberman had discovered that Ash could carry in one trip what took 3 men and a cart half a morning. The timberman paid Walt in good dry wood for the forge. Walt gave Ash the best corner of the shed for it, stacked neat and dry for the winter. The grain store asked for help too. Ash spent 3 mornings moving sacks that had been stacked badly and were at risk of going damp. Hud worked alongside him on the second morning without saying much. On the third morning Hud brought 2 meat pies from the baker and set one on the ground near Ash without making a thing of it. Ash ate it in one careful bite and Hud watched and then nodded to himself the way men nod when something they expected to be complicated turns out to be simple. Market days were the best days. The market set up in the square every 7th day and the whole town came out for it. The first time Ash appeared at the market with Walt there was a ripple of stepping back and held breath. But Nell was there, as she almost always was when Ash was anywhere near the square, and she ran straight to him and climbed up onto his back before anyone had finished deciding how to feel about it. After that it was difficult to be frightened of him. By the third market day there was a queue of children waiting for a turn. Ash stood very still in the middle of the square and let them climb and slide and hang off his tail and argue with each other about whose turn it was. Walt sat on a crate nearby and drank his coffee and watched and occasionally told a child to be careful of the left wing. Even Grant came around in his way. He never said anything directly to Walt about it. But one morning Walt found a jar of good machine oil sitting on his workbench that he had not bought and had not been given. The jar had a trading post label on it. Walt said nothing about it either. He used the oil. It was good quality. In the evenings the yard was quiet. Ash came back every evening without fail. It did not matter where the day had taken him or how far. When the light started going orange over the rooftops he turned toward Walt's yard and came home. Walt always had the forge going. The fire threw warm light across the stones and the heat collected in the corner where Ash slept and kept the frost off through the night. Walt had started carving again. He had not carved anything since Rose. His hands had forgotten how to want to. But one evening he found himself at the workbench with a piece of pale wood and a small knife and his hands moving the way they used to move, without being told. He did not plan it. It simply happened. He carved a drake. He made it small, the same size as Rose's. He took his time with the scales and did not rush the wings. He painted it green when the carving was done, the same green as Ash, and he put yellow in the eyes and a small dot of white in each one to make them look alive. When it was finished, he carried it to the shelf where Rose's letters and drawings lived. He set the new drake beside the old one. The two wooden drakes sat together on the shelf, the old paint and the new paint side by side in the firelight. Ash watched him do it. Walt stood at the shelf for a moment with his hand resting on the wood beside the two small figures. He did not say anything out loud. But in the quiet of the room, with the forge fire warm behind him and the frost settling outside on the rooftops of Millhaven, he said something without words. He said it to Rose. And he said it to the yard and the town and the long strange road that had brought a hungry young drake through a broken fence gap on a cold autumn morning. He turned around. Ash was looking at him from across the room with his old yellow eyes, steady and calm and full of something that had no name in any language Walt knew. Walt pulled his stool close to the forge and sat down. Ash crossed the room and lowered himself to the floor beside the stool and closed his eyes. The fire burned low and warm. Outside, the first frost of winter lay quiet and clean across the town. Inside the small repair shop at the edge of Millhaven, an old mechanic and a young drake sat together in the firelight and needed nothing else. Neither of them had come looking for this. Both of them had found it anyway.